I am 78 years old, sitting by a window at Sunset Manor in Topeka, watching snow drift past the glass like ash from a fire that burned a long time ago. The hallway is quiet at this hour. A cart squeaks somewhere down the corridor, and the radiator ticks like a small clock. I keep a lined notebook on my lap and a dull pencil in my hand. The nurses think I am writing letters to family. It is kinder to let them think that. I have no family left to write. Not the kind who would answer, not the kind who would sign their names with love and mean it. The people who should have protected me are gone. Some died. Some lived the way death lives, near, heavy, taking more than they ever gave. Either way, they do not belong to my present. I belong to my own life now. What I am writing is the truth, the whole shape of it. Plain words, because plain words are strong. I will not dress this up with pretty language. I will not make it worse than it was, and I will not make it softer. I have told bits and pieces over the years, like someone tipping sand from a pocket and hoping no one notices the pile. Tonight I will say it all. I owe that to the girl I once was and to the woman I became anyway. If you are listening, I will ask one thing. Hear it through. There are hard rooms in this house of memory. We will walk through each room with the light on and the window open. I will tell you what I can carry and what I had to set down. I will tell you where help almost found me and where it finally did. And I will tell you the small, ordinary ways a person can rebuild after the worst, stitch by stitch, day by day, with a quiet kind of courage that does not wave flags. This is not a revenge story. I did not win a parade. My victory looks like a safe bed, a locked door, a cup of tea cooling on a sill. My victory looks like breathing without listening for footsteps. People think miracles are loud. Sometimes a miracle is simply surviving long enough to tell the truth while the snow falls and no one is shouting your name. I will begin at the beginning, the place where the road bends and never straightens again. It began the day the cow died, August 15th, 1932, the day the heat felt personal. The day the sky turned the color of old dishwater, and the wind pushed dust through cracks in the window frame like it had a key. Our well had given up weeks earlier. We kept an empty bucket by the door out of habit, the way you leave a chair for a guest you hope might come. Most mornings I carried water from Miller's Creek. 2 miles there, 2 miles back, arms shaking, dress stuck to my back with sweat and grit. By noon, the last milk cow lay on her side near the fence, ribs like a broken barrel. I had tried to wet her mouth with what little I had left, but the water ran down her cheek and into the dirt. When she breathed out, it smelled like old hay and bad luck. When she stopped, even the flies seemed to hesitate, like they were deciding if there was any use left in sticking around. The house leaned in the wind. The fields were a tired brown. Dust settled on everything, on the Bible, on the skillet, on the windowsill where a single grasshopper tried to rub a song out of the heat. I stood with the empty bucket in my hand and listened to the quiet that comes after a living thing gives up. Chester came out of the doorway with a bottle already half gone. His boots scuffed at the step. His shirt was open and stuck to his chest, a dark line of sweat down the middle like a road you should not take. He squinted at the dead cow, then at me. The look on his face made the sun feel colder. "You did this," he said. His words were slurred, but the blame inside them was sharp. "Too lazy to haul enough water. Too slow. Useless." He took another drink and waved the bottle toward the fence, toward the body. "That was money on 4 legs, and you let it die." My mouth opened to tell him about the creek, about how the buckets cut into my hands and how I had poured every drop into the trough and into the cow's mouth and into prayer. But I was 8, and I had already learned that truth is a match that can burn down a small house fast. I closed my mouth and kept my eyes on the empty bucket. "Barn," he said, like the word itself was a rope pulling us both. He grabbed my wrist and dragged me across the yard. Dust swirled around our feet. The boards of the barn were bleached and loose. Light came through in narrow stripes, bright as blades. It smelled like old hay and something sour. A horsefly bumped the window and kept bumping it, the stupid hope of wings. Inside, his breath was a hot cloud of liquor and anger. His hands were hard from work that never paid enough. His voice filled the small space until there was no room left for mine. What happened in that barn was the beginning of a map I would carry for years, a tangle of roads that all led back to fear. I will not lay out every turn of it. I will say this: the barn learned my silence. The boards learned how to keep a secret. When it was over, he lit a cigarette with shaking hands. The match flared and then died, the smoke curling up to the rafters like a thin ghost. He looked at me without seeing me, like I was a tool he'd set down and might pick up again. "You speak of this," he said. "To anyone." He pointed with the lit cigarette. "Ash falling like gray snow, and I'll kill you slow. Bury you behind the house. No one will ask where you went. No one will care," I believed him. Out there, where the road ran straight past us and never stopped, it was easy to believe that no one would come if I shouted, that no one would notice if a small girl vanished into the dry ground. I nodded because nodding was the only thing that did not make the day worse. He left me there among the dust motes and the smell of old hay. I picked up the empty bucket and held it with both hands like it was a shield. A sparrow fluttered in the rafters and found a crack and escaped. I watched the place where it slipped out into the white light and tried to make my breath as small as that bird. Outside, the cow lay quiet. The heat went on. The wind pushed grit against my ankles. I stepped back into the sun and the dust coated my skin again, a thin, stubborn layer I could not scrub off. I thought about water, and how sometimes even the creek runs low, and how sometimes you pour everything you have into a mouth that still goes silent. I walked to the house with the bucket swinging empty against my knee and told myself that if I stayed small, the world might forget to step on me. I did not yet know he wasn't my father. We had no phone, no power. After sunset, the house shrank to what one lamp could touch and the sound of wind pressing at the walls. The road ran past our place like a river that never stopped, but it might as well have been an ocean for how far I could travel. Across the fields lived the Kowalskis, good people with hard hands and kind eyes. 3 miles when the ground was baked. More when the rains turned it to glue. They came by sometimes with a jar of preserved peaches or green beans stacked neat under the lid. Mrs. Kowalski would hold the jar up to the light and say, "Summer in a glass," in her soft, careful English. I would take it with both hands as if it might shatter if I breathed wrong. We traded eggs when the hens were generous. We traded nothing when they were not. It was business on the surface and mercy underneath. Their visits were brief and careful. Chester stood nearby, close enough to hear, far enough to look like he wasn't listening. He had a talent for being in every doorway. I learned to keep my face smooth and my answers short. "How are you, little one?" she would ask. "Fine," I would say, the word a stone in my mouth. "School? When I can." "Your mama's Bible, do you read it?" "Sometimes." She would nod and glance at the doorway where his shadow moved like a second door. One late afternoon in September, when the light fell yellow and thin across the porch, she stayed longer than usual. Chester had drunk himself into a nap. The jar she brought was plum jam, deep and dark. We sat side by side, shelling beans into a dented pan. The wind carried the smell of dust and dry corn. She did not look straight at me. She looked at my arms, where yellow bruises spread like old storms. Her hands kept moving. "You tell me," she said very low, as if she were talking to the beans. "If someone hurts you." The words were not dramatic. They were a small door set into a wall I had been staring at for years. My heart beat so hard I thought the beans would hear it. I opened my mouth. I think I said her name. I think I said, Mrs. The screen door squealed. He stepped onto the porch with sleep still clinging to his face and anger waking behind his eyes. Her hands never stopped their rhythm. "Good afternoon," she said in that steady voice. I was helping with the vegetables. He smiled a smile that meant nothing good. "Much obliged." The rest of the talk slid back into weather and fences. When she stood to leave, she touched my shoulder the way you test a loaf of bread to see if it's done. Not to hurt, just to feel that I was real. He waited until her figure was a small shape on the road. Then he took my chin in his fingers and turned my face hard enough to water my eyes. "What did you two talk about?" "Beans," I said. It was the truth and also not the truth. "Better be," he said and let go. That winter the fever came. It laid me flat and pulled the room away from me. The clock ticked and then it stopped. The ceiling swam. I don't know how many days passed before the door opened and her voice came clear through the fog. Merciful God! She set down her basket and became a storm in the other direction, tidy and useful. Fire in the stove. Water heated. A cloth cooled and turned, cooled and turned. She counted my breaths and lifted my head and held the cup when my hands could not. She stayed 3 days. She did not ask where he was. She did not ask when he would be back. She hummed a song I did not know and spoke to me in English and then in Polish, and somehow both sounded like prayer. On the day the fever broke, she smoothed my hair with a damp palm and said, "You are strong, Dziecko, stronger than you know." It was not a promise of rescue. It was a seed. When the color came back to my cheeks and the world steadied, I took my mother's Bible from the trunk and sounded out words by lamplight. I liked the names that felt like good roads: Ruth, Naomi, Boaz. I liked the parts where people found a way when they had none. I traced the lines with my finger and read out loud in a whisper, as if I could make the walls learn a softer echo. In the spring, I planted a narrow strip of ground behind the house. I dug with a spoon when the soil was too hard for the shovel. I saved the water from washing and poured it into the hill where I had tucked the seeds. Sometimes a green shoot pushed up like a small hand. I would crouch close and say, "Hello, little one," as if the plant could hear me. The garden was not much, but it was a place I chose. I could sit between 2 rows and let my mind lift off my body like a bird and hover where there was no shouting. Later, I would learn the word for this: how the mind can step aside to keep the heart alive. Back then, I only knew that if I pictured a sparrow on the fence line, I could breathe all the way in. On the shelf, I kept the plum jam, unopened, just to look at the way it held summer in a circle of glass. On the windowsill, I kept a seedling in a tin cup, its first leaves shiny and brave. The jam was proof that sweetness could last. The seedling was proof that something small could become a meal if I tended it. People say help is a door that swings wide. Sometimes it is a hand that cools your forehead and a sentence you carry like a match in your pocket. Sometimes it is a jar you open on a cold day and a green shoot that remembers how to rise. Help can come close and still not enter a house. By 15, my body started speaking a language no one had taught me. I woke sick in the mornings and held the edge of the sink until the room stopped tilting. My dresses, hand-me-downs from my mother, grew tight across the middle. I tried aprons and bigger buttons, tried walking with my arms folded, tried pretending a straight back could hide a curve that wasn't there last spring. He noticed before I could find better lies. His eyes tracked the line of my dress and hardened. The fury that followed came fast, aimed with a cruel kind of care. He struck where the bruises would hide and avoided the place that told the truth. It was punishment and denial in the same breath, a man trying to beat back a fact that had already arrived. That was the day Ezra came to the door. Drawn, he said later, by the sound. Ezra was a neighbor in the country sense of the word. Not close, but the nearest person you could name. He was quiet, unmarried, rangy from years of fence mending and wind. He stepped into the doorway and said Chester's name like a warning. When the iron from the stove flashed in Chester's hand, Ezra moved. He took the iron, set it down, and put his body between us the way men do when they want the room to shift around their shape. Enough, he said. The word landed like a door closing. The next minutes are a blur of motion and air. Ezra lifted me too easily and carried me to his wagon. I remember the smell of horses, leather, and the last of summer drying in the ditch. The road to town was rutted. We jolted and slid and then steadied. Ezra kept his eyes ahead. He didn't ask questions. He spoke about the weather, about the harvest running late, about how the road always washed out by the low bridge. His voice was even, as if calm could be handed from one person to another if you spoke steadily enough. The doctor in town was a man in his 60s who had met most of Butler County on their first and last days. He listened to my chest, looked at my arms, took my pulse, and then met my eyes without flinching. He sent a nurse for blankets and hot water. Then he sent a boy for Sheriff Rawlings. The sheriff arrived with his hat in his hands and the weight of the badge in his shoulders. He had known my mother, had once fixed a flat tire for us by the side of the road when I was small. He sat on the stool near the table and asked me to tell him what happened, beginning with the day the cow died and ending with the morning sickness that wouldn't stop. I told him. I used small words. I kept my voice level. The doctor wrote notes that looked like fence posts on a hill, tall, thin, leaning a little. When I was done, the sheriff nodded once, slow, like a man listening to a bell from a long way off. He stood and walked out to the porch where Chester waited with a face already arranged into something like innocence. The click of handcuffs sounded like a lid seating on a jar. An arrest is not an ending. It is a beginning with paperwork. There were forms and statements, and the nurse cut away my torn sleeve with small, careful snips, as if the fabric might bruise too. The doctor's voice went steady and flat as he recorded what he saw. A date was set. I went back to the house and folded my dresses and tried to make a bed that did not smell like fear. For a few nights I slept with my shoes on. The courthouse sat on a square with a flag that had faded to the color of dishwater. On the morning of the trial, the pews filled with faces that pretended not to stare. I sat at a table with the county attorney, who had a kind wife and a tired tie. Across from us, Chester sat with a city lawyer who had shiny shoes and a voice that filled the room in a way truth rarely does. The jury was 12 men who knew the price of corn and the weight of pride. The county attorney laid out the facts in simple rows: dates, bruises, the doctor's report, the sheriff's arrest. He did not dress the facts up because they did not need it. The defense did the opposite. He called me confused, called me wild, called me a girl who had done wrong, and then reached for a story to keep her name clean. He spoke about families and reputations and the danger of letting a child's words break a man's life. I stood and told the truth again. The gavel looked like a shadow on the judge's desk. The pews behind me were very quiet. I could feel the room holding its breath and measuring me against a yardstick I had never seen. When the jury went out, the clock on the wall ticked so loudly it sounded like it might tear a seam in the day. They were back before the minute hand made a full turn. "Not guilty," the foreman said, eyes on the floor. The judge's gavel came down soft, as if louder would admit something had gone wrong. If that were the whole story, I would tell you it ended there. It didn't. News travels differently than verdicts. The town may not have held him to account in the record book, but the whispers wrote a sentence of their own. In the store, men stopped talking when he walked in. Women kept their hands close to their sides. Someone said "horsewhip" under his breath and didn't finish the sentence. The gavel had fallen one way. The faces fell another. 3 nights later, he left. No note, no debt paid. No goodbye. The house sighed, the way a room does when a heavy thing is carried out. I stood on the porch and watched the dark settle over the field. Safety had arrived in a shape that felt like empty air. Safety didn't mean peace. I married Jack in September, when the air had thinned and the fields were the color of toast. He had 80 acres and a calm voice. His house sat square to the road with a proper porch and steps that didn't wobble. On the first night, he flipped a switch and the room came alive, electric light bright as day. He turned a handle and water ran into a sink with a shine you could see yourself in. After years of hauling buckets, I felt something unclench in my chest. Safety is a big word. Sometimes what you really mean is light and water on demand. Jack spoke like a man who kept ledgers straight. "You've had a hard run," he said. "You need steadiness. I could use a good partner. I'm fair." He looked me in the eye when he said it, the way honest people do. He was kind to Tommy, handed him a red ball from the glove box, asked him about marbles and school and if he liked pie. Tommy watched him with a solemn, testing look, the way a boy watches weather and tries to guess if there will be thunder. On the dresser in the bedroom sat a framed photograph of a woman in her 30s with a firm mouth and smooth hair. "Martha," he said, touching the frame with 2 fingers. She was a saint. The word hung in the air like a scent, sweet at first, then cloying. Her dresses still lived in the closet, pressed and wrapped. Her recipes, handwritten in neat, looping letters, were stacked in a tin box on the kitchen shelf. In the laundry room, a row of shirts waited for extra starch because Martha liked the collars to stand tall. At first, the house felt like a reward for having endured. There were clean sheets and a stove that held a steady flame. Jack's voice ran smooth. He said please and thank you. He did not raise a hand or a glass more than once with supper. He fixed the hinge on the back door the day he said he would. He put his boots side by side on the mat. He took pride in order, and after years of chaos, order felt like love. Then came the rules, and they came the way rivers rise, slowly enough that you tell yourself the water is just high this week. Money was his to manage. "I'll take care of bills," he said. "Less for you to worry about." Groceries went on a list he checked. "No need for frills," he said, smiling. Martha did fine with lard and flour. Clothes became a conversation about modesty. Martha preferred dresses below the knee, he would say, fingers tugging gently at the hem as if measuring me against a ghost's tape. "Looks proper." Neighbors noticed things. Friends were weighed and found wanting. "The ladies' auxiliary gossips," he warned. Martha kept her circle small. Safer that way. Church on Sunday, yes. The picnic afterward, no. People drink, say foolishness. When Mrs. Kowalski invited me to stitch quilts with her, he said, "Another time. We've got chores, and besides, too much visiting leads to talk." The photograph on the dresser began to feel like a clock I had to set myself by. If supper was late, Martha planned her day. If I burned the biscuits, Martha never did. If the garden rose went a little weedy in a week of heat, Martha took pride in neatness. He spoke gently, without bite, so gently that I started to wonder if I was overreacting to kindness. That is the trick of a soft voice. It can sand the edge off a command until you only feel the shape of your own compliance. Tommy listened. He learned a different alphabet this time, how disappointment can be spelled with a sigh, how a woman can be pushed into a smaller square without anyone raising their hands or their voice. He copied the tone. "Martha made fried chicken better. he said once, as if reading a weather report. He was 4 then, trusting and exact, trying on authority to see if it fit. The fences tightened in ways that were easy to defend and hard to argue. Jack took the checkbook. He kept the car keys on a nail in the pantry and made a habit of pocketing them before he left for the fields. He preferred I not answer the phone. Martha let it ring when I wasn't home. Kept folks from getting ideas. If a neighbor man waved from his truck, Jack's hand settled on the small of my back, gentle and firm, and guided me into the house. "People talk," he murmured, which was less a claim than a leash. The first time he hit me, it was almost a courtesy, like a boundary marker hammered into ground he already considered his. I had stayed to help a woman down the road whose child had a fever. Supper was late by 30 minutes. He set his fork down, leaned back, eyes steady, and slapped me once across the face. Not hard enough to split the skin, just enough to sting and water my eyes. "Martha never made me wait," he said, mild as a teacher. "A working man needs his meal on time. It happened in the hallway, not the kitchen." The hallway had no windows. He was careful in that way. After, he fetched a cool cloth and pressed it to my cheek. "See?" he said softly. "We understand each other." He kissed the top of my head, like a father praising a child who finally got her sums right. After that, there were longer talks about respect, about good order in a house, about how he worked himself to the bone and needed peace at home. He never yelled. He didn't have to. He set expectations like a row of pressed shirts, identical, crisp, impossible to wear without feeling the starch scratch your neck. I stopped asking to go to town after chores. I stopped reaching for the phone. I learned which meals made his eyes soften and which made them narrow. I made the bed with corners sharp enough to pass inspection. I put Martha's recipes on the counter like offerings. I told myself that rules were better than chaos, that a firm hand on the small of your back is still a hand that touches gently. In the doorway, Tommy watched, absorbing like dry ground takes rain, quick, complete, leaving no puddles to show what fell. He studied cause and effect with a scientist's interest. Late supper, sharp look, burned rolls, long lecture, neighbor's wave, hand on mother's back. He practiced the sigh, the small shake of the head, the sentence that starts, "A wife should..." When the next slap came, it was lower, across the ribs, where a dress would hide it. He explained the rule I had broken and the consequence I had earned. I nodded because nodding ends a scene sooner. Later, alone, I pressed a palm to the bruise and felt a strange, unsteady relief rise in me. Pain can feel like proof you weren't imagining the rest. Harvest season makes people rush. Clouds stack up on the horizon like bills on a kitchen table, and every hour feels like a dare. Jack hitched the wagon too heavy that afternoon and took the steep slope by the north pasture because it cut 10 minutes from the trip. 10 minutes can feel like victory to a man measuring his days in loads. The tractor's nose lifted. The rear wheels clawed at air. Iron tipped backward slow enough for a person to understand what was happening, and fast enough that he could not outrun it. When I found him at dusk, the wagon tongue was bent. The fender bit into the mud like a jaw, and Jack lay pinned under a red weight that had always minded him before. His fingernails were torn and packed with dirt from trying to dig himself free. The motor had gone quiet. Flies made a thin cloud in the cooling air. The coroner came and said the word people say when the truth is plain and still hard to hold. Accident. He wrote it on a line as if writing it made the shape of the loss clean. There was no insurance for poor decisions made in a hurry. The barn filled with the kind of silence that pushes your shoulders down. I washed Jack's shirts one last time, hung them in a neat row, and watched them dry into a future that didn't include the man who wore them. Debts do not mourn. They knock. The bankman stood on the porch with a hat that looked too new for a person who gave bad news often. He carried a folder that had our names and numbers in it. The numbers spoke louder. We sold the bull, and then 3 cows, then parts of machines, then the little things that had made the house feel steady, an extra rocker, a blue bowl Martha had liked, a clock that kept exact time. The farm went next, not in one loud day, but in a thin stream of signatures that finally left us standing with a box of folded clothes and a stack of cooking pans I couldn't part with. We moved back to the shack that had once been the edge of my world. The door stuck in damp weather. The stove sulked before it would draw. I told myself that I had survived there once and could do it again. I told myself anything that sounded like a plan. Tommy did not ask if I was all right. He asked how the tractor flipped, how long a man lives when his lungs have a piano on them, whether Jack knew the exact second the line crossed from hope to nothing. His face was open, curious, the way boys look at anthills and pocket knives. Grief did not enter through that expression. Information did. A week after the funeral, I was carrying wood from the pile when I slipped on a slick stair and fell hard on my arm. The crack sounded like a branch breaking in winter. The pain was a white wall. Dr. Hensley set the bone with the patience of a man who has re-knit many things. He wrapped my forearm in plaster that dried to a chalk shell. He said, "Hold it close. Don't lift. Let others help." We both knew there weren't many others. The cast became part of me. It scratched at night, itched in places no fork could reach. I learned to do daily tasks with the left in my teeth. I hugged wood to my chest and shuffled carefully. I boiled water by moving the kettle an inch at a time, like a piece on a checkerboard. Tommy studied the cast the way he had studied the bent fender. "Does it hurt now?" he asked. "Sometimes," I said. He pressed his thumb along the seam where the plaster ended and skin began. "What about here?" The pressure sent a shot of heat up my arm and into my jaw. I sucked air between my teeth and stepped back. He watched my face like a clock, measured the second it took for the pain to show. The next day he bumped me by accident in the doorway. The day after that he tapped the cast with a spoon, a light ringing sound, and smiled at the noise. "It's hollow," he said, delighted by the fact more than my flinch. I told myself that boys test things. They throw rocks in ponds to see how far the ripples travel. They poke at scabs. They put pennies on railroad tracks to learn what trains can do. I did not want to say the other thing out loud, that he was testing me, that he was learning how bodies answer power. Nights were long again. I listened to the stovepipe tick and made lists in my head. Wood, flour, beans, salt. The bankman's numbers followed me into sleep. I dreamed of the tractor on the hill and woke with the taste of iron in my mouth. In the mornings, I wrapped my cast in a dish towel to keep it clean and tied it with kitchen string because I could not afford the fancy sleeve the doctor had shown me. Tommy's questions kept coming. Not about feelings, but about mechanics. How long does it take bones to grow back? What happens if they grow wrong? Can someone's breath really stop from weight? He asked as if he were planning a lesson for himself and needed the facts straight. When I tried to turn the talk toward school or chores, he slipped away, out the door or out of the conversation, whichever exit was closer. On Sundays, I took him to church even when he rolled his eyes. I wanted him to hear words about mercy spoken from a place higher than my kitchen chair. He watched the preacher, counted the ceiling fans, stared at the gavel shadow shape of the hymn board, and afterward asked if we could leave before people started talking. "They'll say poor dear and offer pie," he said. "We don't need pie." I let him pull me out by the sleeve because sometimes you choose the small fight you can win. In the yard, the tractor fender leaned against the shed, a curve of dented metal catching light. I could not make myself throw it away. It was proof that a thing stronger than a man can still fail him. proof that warnings can be bent into memorials. I rested my cast on it once, careful and quick, and looked at the way rust draws maps on steel. It felt like touching a closed door. I told myself this was a season. Grief turns people odd. Boys try on hardness like a jacket from a hook. Shrug into it, shrug out. I told myself that the questions would soften, that the spoon would stop tapping, that the curiosity about pain would turn into caution, maybe even care. I wanted that so badly I could taste it. I wanted it the way a dry field wants rain, mouth open, eyes closed, believing. I wanted it to be a phase. Wanting isn't truth. At 13, Tommy was taller than me and strong in the forearms from lifting feed and tools. His voice had dropped but not settled. It cracked when he was angry and when he laughed at his own jokes. School became optional in his mind. He went when it suited him, stayed home when it didn't. If the teacher sent a note, he didn't hand it over. If the lawman asked questions, he smiled and said we were managing fine out on the place. People like tidy answers. He learned that early and used it. He also learned schedules, when I was busiest, when I was too tired to argue, when the house was most alone. He kept his tone even the way Jack had. Requests sounded like choices until you noticed there were none. Make coffee. Warm the stew. Find my knife. It was the knife he liked to have near, even when he wasn't using it. Dull from years of work, the blade still caught the light when it lay on the table. He would balance it on one finger, grinning when it tipped and clattered. I put it away. He took it back out. A small tug of war that told the truth about a larger one. The morning the boundary was crossed, I had a fever. My skin was too hot, and my teeth chattered anyway. Wind pressed at the walls and found its way through the cracks. The stove wouldn't catch. I sat on the edge of the bed with a blanket around my shoulders and tried to breathe even. Tommy came in without knocking. He sat, uninvited, on the mattress so the springs squeaked under his weight. "You look cold," he said as if he were naming the weather. He laid his palm on my forehead like he'd seen a doctor do long ago. There was no doctor in the room, only a boy who had learned that if you move calmly and keep your voice low, people will doubt what is happening even as it happens. I will keep this plain. He used size and position, not care, to get what he wanted. I said no, I said stop, I said his name. Words did not move him. My strength was not enough. The room did not help me. When it was over, he stood up as if he had finished a chore and walked to the kitchen. I could hear the pump handle working, the cup set on the table, the slow swallow. The ordinary sounds kept going, which felt like a trick the world was playing. After that morning, the house changed shape. Food, heat, and sleep became tools. He decided when the stove would be lit. He cut the wood when he felt like it, and not when I asked. Some nights I slept under a stack of blankets with my coat still on, listening to the fire give up and the house turn cold. He held the key to the trunk where we kept flour and beans. He said he was preventing waste. He hid the key when he went out. If I asked for it, he said I whined. If I did not ask, he said I was ungrateful. Either way, the lesson was the same. Eat when I say so. He watched my movements and set rules that changed without warning. If I went to the neighbor's fence line, he said I wanted attention. If I stayed inside, he said I was lazy. He liked to knock at my door when I had just fallen asleep, as if the edge of rest were a thing he needed to cut. When I braced the chair under the knob, he laughed and pushed harder. "Don't be dramatic," he said through the wood, and the word felt like a pin pushed into my skin. I began to mark the calendar with the small private counts a woman keeps. The mark slipped. Nausea came back like a memory. My body told me what my mind tried to refuse. I sat at the table with the dull knife in front of me, the blade reflecting the window's thin light, and I let the truth arrive. I was carrying again. There are times when a thought enters you like a guest you cannot send away. It sits. It looks around your life. It asks what you plan to do next. I went outside and stood by the stump where we split wood. The air smelled like old smoke and damp earth. I pressed both hands to the top of the stump and leaned until my forehead touched the rough ring. The world was quiet enough to hear a crow somewhere far off. I did not cry. Tears felt like a luxury I couldn't afford if I wanted a clear head. I made a vow that did not need an audience. This ends with me. Vows do not heat a house. They do not keep a lock from turning. But they steady your hands, and they make your steps sure, and they change what you will endure. I began to plan in the small ways that keep a person alive while they wait for a larger door to open. I moved the kettle closer to the stove during the day so I could light a flame fast at night. I hid a half loaf of bread behind the flour sack and a jar of beans under the sink in a coffee tin with a cracked lid. I wrapped the Bible in an old apron and slid it under the mattress where the board sagged. Not because I thought words on a page could stop a hand, but because I needed a place in the room that still belonged to me. I tucked 2 matches in the hem of my dress, stitched in with blue thread. Small things, foolish to some, but they were proof I had not given up my place in my own story. When he was in a good mood, Tommy talked about the future the way a gambler talks about luck, loud, certain, empty. Once I fix the Ford, we'll be set. Once I get steady work at the mill, you won't have to nag. Once people respect me, things will run my way. He used the word we when he wanted my labor, and I when he wanted my fear. He moved through the house with the dull knife, tapping it against his leg like a rhythm only he could hear. I learned to read that rhythm. A fast tap meant he was looking for trouble. A slow one meant he was making a plan. At church, I sat in the back pew and listened to the sermon about turning the other cheek and thought about how many cheeks a person has and what turning looks like when you have run out of places to turn. The gavel-shaped shadow of the hymn numbers fell across the wall. People shook hands and carried pie to the tables. I stood in the doorway and watched other lives move in neat circles and reminded myself that circles can be broken. One night, he came home late, whiskey on his breath and pride in his step. The stove was out. He banged the lid with the poker and told me to make food. The cupboard was near empty. I said so. He called me useless and reached for the dull knife like a man reaching for punctuation. The blade flashed, not bright but sure. He didn't press it to skin. He set it on the table and tapped it once, twice, 3 times. A beat, a dare. I looked at the knife and then at the unlit stove and felt something in me settle, not down, but in. The weather began to change. Heat broke and gave way to heavy air. Clouds rose in the west in tall gray stacks. The radio in town said the season would be rough, that the ground was ready, that the sky had been holding back. I walked home with flour on my skirt and wind in my hair, and watched the first far-off flash that meant the fields and roofs would soon be tested. The calendar lost track of itself as days ran together, but the sky kept better records. The crickets grew loud. The dull knife on the table reflected a thin stripe of light that came and went as clouds moved. I kept bread in the coffee tin and matches in my hem and a vow in my mouth like a line I could bite to keep from sinking. Storm season arrived. The storm started before sundown, a low growl rolling over the fields like a wagon you can't see yet. By dark, thunder was speaking in full sentences and lightning was writing its answer across the sky. The roof popped as it took the weight of rain. Wind pushed at the seams of the house until they whistled back. I moved the kettle near the stove and set the cast iron skillet on the front burner. The way a person places a hand on a doorknob, she may need to turn fast. The cupboard was a study in air. 1 tin of beans, 2 cracked plates, a heel of bread wrapped in a rag. He had the key to the trunk again. The stove was out. I had saved the last of the wood for morning. I sat at the table to stretch the quiet a minute more and counted my breaths by the flash and thunder. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3, crack. The door banged open, and Tommy filled the frame with wet and pride. Whiskey rode ahead of him like a herald. He shook rain from his jacket onto the floorboards as if the house were a ditch. "Food," he said, simple as pointing. "Something good." "There isn't much," I said, steady. "I can heat beans." "Beans," he repeated, mouth curling. "You save the good stuff for yourself?" His eyes slid to the stove, then to the cold hearth. He liked evidence: cold stove, empty shelf, a mother he could call a liar and make it sting. Lightning washed the room white. For a second I could see everything at once: the dull knife on the table, the skillet waiting, the door behind him breathing rain into the kitchen, the kettle a short reach from the box of matches tucked in my hem. The world went dark again and thunder answered from above. He took the knife in hand, not raised, just there, a period at the end of his sentence. Tap, tap, twice on the table. "Make food," he said, each word its own small order. I stood and moved toward the stove. My hands knew the path: match, paper, kindling, the muscle memory of 1,000 suppers ready to lie for me again. He came closer than the work required. The knife flashed the way tin flashes in a storm. No brilliance, just certainty. "Don't play me," he said. "Don't tell me about not much. Make it." The wind shoved at the house and the lamp glass clicked against its brass. I struck the match. It bloomed and bent in the draft. The tiny light felt like a thing I could swallow. I put it to the paper, and the paper to the kindling, and the kindling to the stove's small throat. When the flame caught, it found its voice and held it. Heat rose soft and promising against my knuckles. He leaned past me and set the knife on the table again, close enough that I could hear the point knock wood. A dare in Morse code. I lifted the skillet, heavy and familiar, the metal seasoned by years of grease and sorrow. When I set it on the new flame, the iron spoke a little, tick, tick, as if remembering. He reached for my wrist, not fast, not slow, confident the way people are who believe a house is theirs down to the air. His fingers closed, and the space around me narrowed to the bones in my arm, and the heat on my face, and the sound of rain drilling the roof. The body is a clear thinker when it is cornered. It moves without a meeting. I shifted my weight the way you do when a bucket is about to pull you off balance, and I brought the skillet up and around in one hard arc, a circle cut from years of lifting, hauling, stirring. The iron met the side of his head with a sound I still hear sometimes in the middle of a quiet afternoon. A deep, flat note that belonged to no instrument I know. He stumbled, a boy again for a breath, surprised to find gravity in the room. Blood showed dark at his temple, and then bright as the next lightning answered. The knife fell and skated across the table, clinked to the floor, spun once, stopped. I did not wait to see where it settled. I moved. The door to the porch fought me with swollen wood and then gave. Rain hit my face so hard it felt like 1,000 small hands pushing me back inside. I went forward anyway. Mud took my feet to the ankles. The porch boards were slick as tongues. I made it 2 steps before he came through the doorway and caught the back of my dress. We went down together into the yard, the earth soft from weeks of holding back. We slid, clutched, rolled. His hands went for my throat because that is a lever men learn early. I turned my face aside and he got my jaw instead. The world narrowed to breath and grip and the taste of rain and rust. He tried to fix me in place. I learned long ago never to be where a hand expects me to be. I twisted, I clawed. I bit his fingers when they came close, and he howled, angry, surprised, almost laughing at the nerve of me. Lightning made a white room around us and then slammed the door. Thunder shook the air low enough to feel in my ribs. He was stronger and younger and used to winning by weight. I was older and used to living by angles. When he pinned my shoulder, I twisted my hips. When he reached for my hair, I gave him a handful and came up with his wrist. Mud made us both clumsy. Mud made us both free. Headlights turned the rain into ropes of light. The beam swung across the yard and caught us, the two of us a knotted shadow on the ground, and then steadied. A car door slammed. Boots hit puddles in fast, sure steps. "Hey!" a voice shouted, the word cut short by the wind. "Hey!" A big man dropped to his knees beside us and got a hand on Tommy's collar and a forearm across his shoulders, clean and practiced, like he'd pulled calves from a ditch. "Easy," he said, not to Tommy, to the night, to me, to himself. "Easy." Tommy bucked, swore, lunged for the knife that wasn't there. The man hauled him back with a grunt and pinned him to the slick grass without malice. "I've got you," he said, a sentence that can mean more than one thing. "Phone?" I gasped. "Sheriff." The man, Joe Murphy, a salesman whose car had coughed and died exactly where Providence wanted it to, nodded once and looked toward the road. "Neighbor's line," he said. "I saw the light. I'll run." He kept Tommy face down with one knee and reached for me with his free hand, not to pull me close, but to anchor me to something that was not the storm. "Breathe," he said, like he was telling himself too. He called out to someone staying dry in the car. "Hold the wheel." And then he was gone and back again, and then gone in the direction of the neighbor's house, his shoulders squared into the rain. Time did odd tricks. The storm filled the spaces between seconds. Tommy spit curses that sounded small against thunder. I sat on the porch step with the skillet in my lap like a shield I had finally learned to raise. The sheriff's headlights came sooner than I thought, and later than I wanted. The men moved the way men do when they've done this before, calm, step by step, no heroics. Hands, cuffs, words. The knife was found and lifted with a handkerchief. A blanket appeared around my shoulders. Someone asked if I could stand. I could, I did. The porch light hummed. Rain ran off the roof in sheets and then in ropes and then in threads. I watched them put my son in the back seat. He looked at me once through the wet and the flashing and gave me a smile that wasn't a smile at all. It was a ledger balanced, a problem solved, a note he would tuck away for later if there were a later to have. The door shut. The car pulled away. The yard was a map of our struggle that the rain already began to erase. The night held still at last, the way a room does after a long argument. The skillet cooled under my palms, heavy and honest. The neighbor's porch light blinked twice and then found its steady hum. Somewhere a dog barked like a clock returning to work. I sat and felt each breath arrive and leave as if I had to relearn the steps. People imagine relief is light and sudden. It is not. It is a slow, cautious thing, like stepping onto a floor you thought might give way and finding it holds. I wrapped the blanket tighter and let the storm do what storms do, empty themselves. The cost of telling would come next. The hospital room was pale and clean, with a window that made the storm look like a story someone else was telling. A nurse wrote my name on a band and slid it over my wrist. The rubber tugged at the bones there. A small circle that said, "You are accounted for." Dr. Hensley stood at the foot of the bed with his glasses low on his nose and his hands folded like he was holding something fragile. He spoke in the voice people use when they have to say hard things softly. The pregnancy did not hold. The body has limits. Rest now. Grief came quiet, like fog at ground level. It did not wail. It did not demand. It pressed against the ankles and waited. Relief came too, thin, guilty, unmistakable. Two truths sat side by side and refused to move to make room for the other. I turned my face to the wall and let both be true. The nurse tucked the blanket closer. She did not ask me to decide which feeling was allowed. The sheriff came with papers and a steadiness that made the room feel less breakable. "We have your statement," he said. "We have Mr. Murphy's eyewitness. We have the knife. We have photographs and the doctor's report." He spoke in inventory, facts as ballast. He tipped his hat to the nurse on his way out. Like courtesy could hold the door while justice got its boots on. The courthouse filled again, because it always does when the story is sharp enough to cut and people want to touch the blade without bleeding. The prosecutor laid out the case like a row of fence posts: dates, wounds, weather, witnesses. He did not decorate. He did not need to. The defense worked another angle: a boy raised in a hard house by hard men, a product of what he saw, a creature of the environment that shaped him. As if cause were the same as consent. As if learning a thing forced you to love it. Tommy took the stand. He sat too straight, as if posture could pass for character. He used his careful voice at first, the one he had practiced on teachers and bank clerks. Then the questions tightened, and the careful voice broke around the edges. He spoke about order, about who decides when supper is ready, about who holds the keys. He used words like teach and deserve. He said I didn't fight hard if I really didn't want what he wanted. He said he had to put me back in place. The room went still in that way a room will when it recognizes something it doesn't want to name. The jury was 12 fathers again. They watched a boy talk like a man who had borrowed all the worst tools and sharpened them for his own hand. When they left, the clock ticked the slow kind of tick that makes people breathe shallow. When they returned, they did not look at him. "Guilty," the foreman said. And then the judge spoke the words that carry the weight of years: life in prison. 13 years old, and the door closed behind him with a soft clack that I felt in my teeth. After the hearing, I took off the hospital bracelet. The rubber left a faint ring on my skin, a ghost circle that would fade. I sold what could be sold and folded the rest into a small suitcase with a broken latch. At the depot, the clerk slid a bus ticket under the glass. It was thin as a communion wafer and promised something like absolution, Kansas City. One way, on the ride, fields unspooled like cloth. Towns came and went. People boarded with paper bags and babies and sat with the heaviness of their own stories. I kept my suitcase between my feet and one hand on the folded ticket like it might fly if I let it go. In the city, noise replaced weather. Streets crossed in neat right angles. Nobody knew my name. Nobody needed to. I found a room with a bed that held and a bolt that slid. I found work where the machines hummed and the forewoman said, "Good stitch," instead of Martha would have. I learned which streets stayed lit late and which ones didn't. I learned the bus lines and where to stand so I could see my stop before it saw me. I learned how to sleep through the night. Kansas City taught me a different kind of weather. Streetcars and steam grates, morning bread smells, the steady hush of people going about their hours without asking anyone's permission. I rented a room on the second floor above a grocer who stacked apples like little red suns. The door had a bolt that slid smooth. I kept the key on a string around my neck the first month, then in my pocket, then in a dish by the sink once my hand learned that safety could be a habit. Work came at a garment factory where the forewoman had a pencil behind her ear and a voice that kept things moving. The machines spoke in one long sentence all day, needles up and down, thread whispering through guides, bobbins ticking toward empty. I like the rules there. Cloth does not lie. A straight seam is a straight seam. If it puckers, you take it out and do it again. No man's temper decides if the line is good. They put me on hems and waistbands. I learned to keep my foot light on the pedal, to guide with fingertips, to feel when the fabric wanted to wander and nudge it back. A thimble snugged my middle finger. By lunch, there'd be a little ring pressed into the skin, proof of work done clean. I stitched 100 small dignities in a day and carried none of them home but the tired that means you earned your pillow. I made friends on the line slow, the way you plant beans after the last frost. Lila with the copper laugh who brought hard candy wrapped in crackling paper. Mrs. Bell, who had a widow's quiet and a knack for teaching without making you feel taught. We did not trade our worst days all at once. We traded casserole dishes and spool ends, thimbles borrowed and returned. In time, we traded truths in pieces small enough to carry. My first husband drank, Mrs. Bell said, rolling a seam flat. He quit at the end. Lila said, "Some nights I sleep in the chair so my back remembers what it is to be straight." I said, "I like the sound of keys." And they nodded like they understood the whole story without needing the chapters. Evenings were mine. I boiled an egg and sliced it neat. I read 2 pages of the Bible in one of the library book I kept under the radio. I pressed my hand to the window pane in winter and told myself, "You are here." No past tense, no future promises, just the good weight of now. On Saturdays I swept, laundered, folded each shirt with the care I used to beg from the air, and set them in a drawer that slid without sticking. On Sundays, I took my own pew in the back and sang soft, not for show, for breath. Men asked sometimes. A neighbor with decent hands and a decent hat tipped his brim and said I had a nice way about me. A mechanic at the corner garage offered a ride home in the rain twice and then stopped offering when I thanked him. Without stepping toward the truck, kindness is not always a key. I chose solitude because the lock I had picked finally sat open, and I was not ready to test doors again. Peace came in small rituals, airing pillows on a line, oiling the sewing machine at home until it purred, keeping a tin of tea and a square of sugar like treasure. I mended for neighbors, not for money, for the pleasure of turning a rip into a story that kept going. I kept a jar on the sill with a single cutting rooting in water, a green stem making up its mind to turn into something with leaves. I wore a plain ring I bought for myself at Woolworth's, not to claim to remember. You can give yourself what you once waited to receive. In the drawer with my thimble, I kept a folded scrap of the bus ticket. It had no power beyond memory, but memory can be a map. When sleep was thin, I laid the ticket and the thimble side by side and told myself, "You earned both. One for leaving, one for staying." Years layer quiet like quilts. You don't notice the weight until you pull it up one night and realize you are warm. I learned the names of the women at the corner bakery, the hour the milkman clinked his bottles on the stoop below, the way the city light softened snow into a glow you could walk through without thinking of ash. I did not forget. The past will write its return address on you, but I chose when to answer. The doorbell rang sometimes, and it was only the grocer with a bruised peach he couldn't sell. Sometimes it was Lila with a cake she said she'd baked too much of on purpose. And sometimes it was no one at all, just the old habit of listening for footsteps, and then remembering the lesson I stitched into the hem of my days. The past can still knock, sometimes in an envelope. The phone at the boarding house desk rang for me on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that folds itself neatly and asks nothing more. "Ma'am," the clerk said, covering the mouthpiece, "a lawyer in Topeka." I took the call standing by the pigeonholes where mail slept. The voice on the line was careful. "My name is Robert Hutchins. I'm handling the effects of a deceased man named Chester Mullins. County Storage turned up a box with your name tied to it. If you're willing, I'd like you to come." The county office smelled like floor wax and old paper. Metal fans turned the air in slow circles. On the table sat a brown carton with a twine cross knotted tight and a county seal slapped across the lid like a hand saying, "Don't." Mr. Hutchins slid a form toward me, and I signed my name with the steady hand I had earned. He cut the twine, broke the seal with a small blade, and opened the past as if it were a drawer. Inside lay a scatter of living and dying, a pocket knife, 2 belt buckles, a cracked harmonica, a folded shirt that still held the shape of a shoulder. Under that, envelopes bundled in string. The top bundle was labeled in a hard, leaning script I knew from grocery lists and warnings on scrapwood, Chester. The second bundle bore a different hand, clumsy and crowded. Ezra. We started with Chester. The lawyer put on soft cotton gloves like a church ritual and eased the first letter open. No salutation. Just ink, thick in places where the pen had stopped and started again. He had written to no one and everyone, to God maybe, to a man he had been before he learned to hate me for being what I was. The sentences wandered but arrived. He wrote about the bottle. He wrote about the day the cow died. He wrote the word hurt without any of the lies men usually tuck around it. He said, "I did it," and then said it again in a way that made the paper feel heavier in my hands. Some of the letters carried names under his, witnesses from campfires and shelters where he had drifted. Men who had signed the page to say they saw him write it, heard him read it out loud, watched him fold it and tuck it into a Bible he stole and then lost. It wasn't court. It wasn't a gavel. But it was a kind of ledger finally balancing on a dusty table. Paper can be delayed justice. It can also be the only kind you get. We opened 3, then 5, then more. Each said the same thing in different weather. Shame that came too late. Blame he tried to hide under anger for too long. The shape of a life smaller than a man should live. I did not forgive him in that room. Forgiveness is not a trick you perform because ink tells you to. But something in me loosened that had been tightened for decades by the thought that I had been crazy. That the story I told in court had been a dream other people said out loud for me. The letters were proof I had not been speaking to a wall. Mr. Hutchins set the first bundle aside and looked at the second with a different face. "These," he said, "are from Ezra Harland." The name touched a cold place in me I hadn't visited in years. He slipped the knot, took out the top page, and read in a voice that stumbled where the letters did. Ezra's hand was clumsy, but the meaning was clear. What I took? Couldn't help myself. Tried to make it right by helping after. He had written it out like a man who believed if you put the worst thing in your life on paper, it might shrink to fit the page. The dates ran back to the year my mother was dying. He spoke of coming by with wood, with eggs, with a hand that reached where it had no right to reach. He wrote about the day he heard Chester and stepped in, not because the noise carried across the field and offended his sense of order, but because the noise told on him. He wrote about the boy with my eyes. He did not write the word son. He did not have to. Truth is not a door that closes once and lets you rest. It is a house with many rooms, and sometimes you find a new one at 60 years old and have to walk through it with your hand on the wall. I had laid so much of Tommy at Chester's feet, his temper, his easy reach for power, his taste for control sharpened by shame. In that office, with the county seal curling on the broken lid and twine coiled like a snake asleep, I moved some of the weight to where it belonged. Not all choices are choices, but blood can carry a map, and a boy can follow it until someone takes the pen away. Mr. Hutchins asked if I wanted copies. I said yes. He asked if I wanted the originals. I said yes to that too. He slid the envelopes back into the box and tied the twine with a neat square knot that looked, for once, like a thing meant to hold gently and not bind. I carried the box home like it held something living. In my room, I set it on the table next to my sewing machine. I made tea and didn't drink it. I opened the window and let the city air move the curtains. I untied the twine, lifted the top letter, and read each word alone. the way you take stitches out of a seam you once thought sound. The hurt did not disappear. It changed temperature. It moved from under my ribs to the table where I could see it. Later, I slid the letters into a clean envelope of my own and sealed it. I wrote on the front in my careful hand, "For the record." Then I tied it with new twine and set it beside my thimble as if the two belonged to the same work, the mending and the naming. Knowing doesn't change the past, but it lightens what you carry. There are no children to carry my name into rooms I will never see. No little face will tilt up and ask why a certain shadow follows our family, why tempers come quick, why doors feel heavy from the inside. The line stops here, by choice and by the plain arithmetic of time. People hear that and make a sad face like an empty cradle is the only story a woman can tell at the end. But an empty cradle is also an empty chain. Some endings are mercies. The proof is in the small freedoms, the kind nobody writes parades for. I bought myself a dress once because the fabric felt kind between my fingers, not because anyone would approve it. Navy cotton with tiny white dots, a skirt that swished when I walked. I took it into the fitting room, turned this way and that, and decided I liked the woman in the mirror. At the counter, I paid with bills I had folded into my purse that morning, and the clerk tucked tissue around the dress like it deserved gentleness. I carried the bag home as if it held something alive. I make tea in the afternoons, not because it is an occasion, but because it marks the hour between work and rest. I set the kettle on, hear the slow climb toward boil, feel the first good steam on my face. The cup warms my hands and the saucer makes its small, honest clink. I stand at the window while the city light turns softer and watch people moving along the sidewalk. Men with their hats, women with paper sacks, children dragging their feet at the end of a day. On my sill sits a plant in a chipped pot, sun on its leaves like a quiet blessing. I drink and do not listen for footsteps. Locks click in the evening, and the sound does not raise anything in my throat. The hall outside my door can be busy or still. It does not ask me to make myself smaller to pass through it. I put the key in a dish by the sink without counting how fast I could reach it if the knob turned the wrong way. Memory flinches sometimes. Old muscle, old training. But peace has a way of retraining your hand until it rests open again. I used to imagine victory as something loud, a judge's hammer cracking wood, a crowd standing up, a man's head bowed in a public place. We are taught to look for banners. I learned to recognize quieter flags. A straight seam, a pantry with 2 tins of something you like and no one else rationing your spoon. A bus ride where your seat is a choice and not an order. A night where you sleep, wake once, listen and smile at the silence because it is yours. I keep my life tidy, not because I fear what a mess might invite, but because order is a gift I can give myself. Sheets aired. Hem mended. Floor swept until the broom finds nothing to say. There is a holiness to simple tasks done without threat. I let myself rest on Sundays. Real rest, not the kind where you hold still so trouble won't see you move. I sit by the sunny window with a teacup and a slice of bread buttered to the edges and read a page from a book that asks nothing of me but attention. Sometimes people ask if I forgave the men in my story. Forgiveness is a door with many hinges. Some swing, some rust. Some are not mine to oil. I do know this. I put down what was not mine to carry. I stopped making excuses for other people's hands. I left rooms that needed me small. I chose to live in a body like it belonged to me, not to anyone else's temper or memory. That is its own kind of absolution. There were apologies I never got and apologies I never offered because there was no safe way to send them where they needed to go. I do not keep those debts anymore. I light a certain candle on certain dates and name the truth to the flame. What was done, what I survived, what I refuse to pass on. The wick burns steady, and when I blow it out, the smoke lifts and disappears like a thought that has found its ending. If someone were to ask what success looks like after a life like mine, I would walk them to this window. I would pour tea into 2 cups and point. There, the plant that outgrew its pot. The dress folded in the drawer waiting for a day I will choose. The shoes left by the door toes out because I am not braced to run. I would tell them that quiet is not an empty room. It is a room where you can hear yourself breathe and recognize the sound as good. I do not have a headstone to visit for a line that ends with me. I have mornings that begin with me and afternoons that hold steady, and evenings that close like a gentle book. The war I won is measured in ordinary hours. The news did not print it. The neighbors did not whisper it. But I live in the proof. I kept 4 objects to remember how the cracks were filled. On the table in front of me are 4 simple things. A seed packet, soft from years of thumbs. It reminds me of the small garden behind the old house, where I tucked hope into hard ground and watered it with wash water saved in a pan. Seeds don't argue with the pest. They ask for light and a little patience, and then they lift. A Bible with a cracked spine and penciled notes in the margins where I taught myself to read. Those pages were a lamp when the room was dark. They gave me names for courage when I had none of my own yet, and they kept the sound of mercy nearby so I could find it again later. A cast-iron skillet, cleaned and oiled, heavy in the hand. It cooked 1,000 quiet meals. It also made a single loud decision. You do not need to love a tool for what it was forced to do to be grateful that it was there when you needed it. An envelope of letters, tied with fresh twine. Paper does not erase, it names. It puts weight back where it belongs. Sometimes the only justice you get is the kind that comes in handwriting. These 4 objects are not trophies. They are parts. If I could set one more thing on this table, it would be a bowl with a gold seam, the kind repaired by care instead of hidden with shame. I learned that the crack is not the end of the story. What fills it is, healing does not mean they suffer. Healing means you rebuild yourself with honest hands and refuse to pass the brake forward. If you are listening, and some room in this story sounds like one of yours, I am speaking to you now. You do not have to tell everything today. You do not have to make a speech or forgive before you are ready. You can start with a sentence as small as a seed. You can set one true thing on your own table and sit with it until the shame slips off and the name of it remains. You are allowed to choose safety over spectacle. You are allowed to leave a room and call that leaving a victory. When the time came, I learned to sort what was mine to carry and what never was. I learned to keep keys in a dish and peace in a cup of tea and the door open only to those who step in gently. I learned that truth spoken plain is a steady glue. It does not shout. It holds. If this story felt true to you, if some piece of it matched a piece you have been hiding, I invite you to share the moment someone finally believed you. Or, if that hasn't happened yet, share the moment you first believed yourself. Your words might be the small lamp in a hallway someone else is walking tonight. If you want more calm, fact-checked stories told without sensational noise, stories that set the table with simple objects and let the truth do the work, you can subscribe. You can stay. There will be room for you here, and there will be light enough to see the shape of what you've survived. I will clear the table now and fold my hands for a while. Outside, the day is soft at the edges. The plant on the sill turns its leaves toward whatever sun remains. I stand, make tea, and watch steam rise like a line of gold finding its place in an old crack. Take care of your own heart tonight. It has carried you a long way.